if you just hope this is going to fire up. Yes, it is. How many of you came in along the Packway today? Right. That is the Packway in 1912. So as you can see, no church, no accommodation blocks, no pub, no shops, nothing. Now, just to reiterate the point, I think Joe made it at the introduction. We're going to go back to 1909 and just picture this. Out there was nothing. No houses, no trees, no roads, nothing. From here all the way to Stonehenge was open land. Going back that way, none of those houses were there. It was open land all the way back to what is the main road now, down towards Durrington. Okay. This picture is of a student pilot learning to fly, probably taken sort of just up the road here, looking that way. So we're going back to 1909. And this guy, for people who can read captions, and I trust you all can, this is a guy called Horatio Barber. Horatio Barber was a con man. He was a scam merchant. He'd made a lot of money in Canada selling dodgy, illegitimate share certificates to silver mines that didn't exist. Okay? There was a silver rush in Canada in the early years of the 20th century, and they did open up a couple of small silver mines which produced quite an output of silver ore. Lots of people then ran over there and started staking claims and saying, look, I've got a new silver mine, I've got a patch of land. And they sold share certificates. Horatio Barber, who was living in Britain, thought, this is a new scam I can get in on. Went over to Canada, sold lots of these share certificates, most of which were completely dud. Okay? People began to realise this after a couple of years when there was no silver coming out of the ground. So he decided to pack up all his money, his ill-gotten gains, and come back to Europe. So he went from Canada down to New York, got on a ship, came across the Atlantic. Before he got on the ship, he went to a casino, made a lot more money in a casino, and came back to Europe. He got on a ship in France, Cherbourg, and the first thing he did was he went to an exhibition of automobiles. At the exhibition, there were also some aeroplanes, very early aeroplanes. Now, this is 1908, 1909. We just had the first flight in Britain by anybody. We've got Louis Blériot flying the English Channel. He went to this exhibition, saw these French aircraft and thought, this is something I can get in on and make some money. So he came back to Britain and applied to various people to help him get into aviation. He rented a railway arch in Battersea in South London and started building aeroplanes. He built an aeroplane, looked outside and thought, I can't fly this because everywhere is surrounded by terraced houses. So what am I going to do? He approached the War Office and asked, can I borrow a piece of land? The War Office said, yes, you can have a piece of land at Larkhill, or as it was known then, the Hill of the Larks, or Durrington Down, various names. It was just up here at the top of the road. If you go out here and walk up the road here, just before you get to the main road, on the right-hand side, there's a strip of concrete in the trees. That's where his original aircraft shed was. Okay? So he built this shed, and I use the word shed very carefully, and he started playing with aeroplanes. This is what he built. Now it looks like a reasonably sensible aeroplane. Got an engine, it's got wheels, it's got a pilot seat, it's got two propellers. It does have a tail, although you can't see it in the photographs, the sort of triangle there. It looked very good, but it didn't fly. So he took it back into his shed, played around with it, and came up with a modification that looked like that. This did fly. Okay. In case you're wondering, ASL stands for the Aeronautical Syndicate Limited. He had two other guys helping him financially. As I said, he built this. He turned the original aeroplane round, so the engine's now at the back, the tail's at the front, the pilot's facing this way now. This did eventually fly, but it was flown by the gentleman sat there, who was not Horatio Barber, it's his chauffeur. Horatio Barber, who was very rich, as you know, and had a big car, had a chauffeur. And he said to his chauffeur one day, "Bertie Woodrow, Mr. Chauffeur, you drive my car, you can drive my aeroplane." Open brackets, because I'm not going up in the damn thing, close brackets. So poor old Bertie Woodrow went out the front here in this contraption, ran this around on the ground for a couple of minutes, got the feel for how it worked, and hit a large lump in the ground and bounced up into the air. He flew around for about a minute and a half, something like that, and eventually, by playing with the controls, managed to get it to come down, landed, bent the aeroplane badly, the wheels and all that sort of stuff, but he had flown successfully. And that was the first flight ever here at Larkhill. Okay? And as you can see, it was in the early days of 1910. So we had Horatio Barber and his chauffeur top of the road building this and flying it. These two guys then heard what was going on. Captain John Fulton, Royal Field Artillery, was serving in South Africa, and he came back, as people always did, through Europe, stopped over in France, and went to an exhibition and saw what the French were doing. And he started thinking, from the point of view of being in the army, in the artillery, what can I do to promote flying in the British Army? And he had a couple of ideas, and he got together with this guy, George Coburn. They built two further sheds at the top of the road here, and they set up a flying school, teaching people to fly. They charged £75 for a course of tuition, and they said, if you pass that and you get your pilot's licence, we will then refund you the money, and you can then, because he was a military personnel, you can then fly for either the Army or the Royal Navy. So he set up this flying school, and they started teaching people to fly just at the top of the road here. This is the sort of aircraft they were using. It's called a Bristol box kite. It's based on French design. The French sold us a couple of these on the promise, on the contract, in the promise in the contract that they would fly. We got them over here after a certain amount of argument, legal argument, and we discovered they didn't fly very well. So we then modified them and put these new control surfaces on the front of the aeroplane. The French got upset and said that you're mucking around with our patent, our aircraft, and they said, well, fine, but you know, you've published the plans, they're in the public domain, we've modified the aeroplane, your fault, not ours. The picture, as you can see from the caption, is an artillery officer ready for flight. There he is sat there at the front of the aeroplane with a couple of guys hanging on the tail to stop the aeroplane running away. No brakes. You can just in the background see another aeroplane, which, unlike this one, which is a biplane, that's a monoplane. And also in the background, you can just see there the outline of one of the sheds just up the road here. Okay? And this is 1909, the first sheds, although some people are now starting to call them hangars as opposed to sheds. So we've now got 3 hangars at the top of the road, people flying around here having a good time and gradually learning what they're doing. 1910, a company called Bristol Tramways Corporation, who they got a bit fed up with making trams. They'd built trams all over Bristol and they thought, we need something new. So they decided to look at aviation and aeronautics. They formed a company called the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company. Those 3 buildings are the buildings that we're sitting in. We are sat in that one. And there are the 2 windows which you can just see behind me. The British and Colonial Aeroplane Company, they had a site at Filton in Bristol. That was where they built the aeroplanes, but they couldn't fly them there because Bristol and Filton were built up with houses. So they'd bring the aircraft down here by road, do final assembly here and fly them out the front, just here where the houses now are. It would be lovely if somebody would let us paint the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company along the front of the hangars, but they won't. Colonial is probably not a word that we want to stick up out there at the moment. But, and as you can see, we've got 3 Bristol box type aeroplanes parked out the front, and we've got a chain link fence on some posts, because a lot of people from the villages of Durrington and around, and from Amesbury, were coming up here to see what was going on, to look at the aeroplanes, because they'd never seen an aeroplane. And they were coming up and sort of kicking the tyres, prodding the fabric, pulling the strings, all that sort of stuff, and breaking the aeroplanes, as people do. So they put this chain link fence up just generally to keep the public away. The hangars were built in the summer of 1910. They were made corrugated iron, and they were bare earth floors. So imagine this is the middle one. All the breeze blocks aren't here. The roof's not there. You've got the pitched roof up there. All of it's corrugated iron. Bare earth floor, door out there, open to the wind and the cold and the rain. No heating, no kitchen, no toilets. Just 3 walls, a roof and a door. The first winter they were in here, so that's the winter of 1910 and 1911, was so cold and damp that when they came back in the spring, all the aircraft stored inside these hangars, the fabric had peeled off, the wings had warped, the struts were all out of alignment, the cables had all rusted, so they basically had to rebuild the aeroplanes because it was so damp and cold in here. Okay. They did later on put pot-bellied stoves in here to keep some warmth in here. But just bear in mind that in these primitive conditions, people were not only maintaining the aeroplanes, also maintaining the engines, doing really skilled technical work in a cold, damp, wet, freezing cold January environment. Slightly better picture now, been painted and colorised. We've got a box kite overhead being flown by Monsieur Maurice Tetard. The chief instructors at this time were all still French, and a lot of the technology, the engines and everything, was still French as well. But as you can see, this is now the Bristol Flying School. That's the hangar that we're in, and you see what I mean about the public coming up and having a look around and seeing what's going on. The next gentleman we talk about is this guy, Captain Bertie Dixon of the Royal Horse Artillery. Now Bertie Dixon, great guy that he was coming towards the end of his service in the army. And he was travelling back from Africa through Europe to Britain, and he went to an exhibition in France. We have the same vein here, France, France, France all the time. Saw what the French were doing and thought, the British need to catch up with this, because he could see the potential of aviation. So he came back to this country. He arrived here in the summer of 1910, and he asked the War Office in London for permission to be an impartial umpire in the autumn 1910 army manoeuvres. The reason he wanted to do this, he had the idea of flying his aeroplane around to see what he could see from the air while the army were doing their exercises. Now, the idea of the exercises was that the Red Force were defending this line here, and the Blue Force, the opposition, were coming up from that direction, and they would attack this location. Bertie Dixon had the idea of flying out that way, spotting the oncoming force, observing their layout and their formations and their deployments, and then reporting back. Now, he could either fly back here, land and make a verbal report. He could fly back here and drop a weighted piece of paper with some scribbled notes on it. Or his third option, which he chose, was to land, find a phone box, get on the phone and say, guess what I've seen, guys, XYZ, ... southwest. That's what he did. He phoned back from a phone box to a phone just in here, which is the rooms that are now our crew room, our tea room, cafe. And he reported back that the approaching force, the Blue Force, were deployed to the southwest, and they had X number of horses, X number of wagons, X number of whatever. Now, as I said, he'd done this from a phone box. The problem was, when he came out the phone box, he realised that he, his aeroplane, and the phone box had been captured by the Blue Force, which rather defeats the point of the exercise, you know. But he had established the concept of aerial reconnaissance beyond visual range observation and reporting back to a ground station. Okay. The next picture, actually, this is his aeroplane. It's another Bristol box guide. This is some of the horses and cavalrymen of the Red Force who, remember, were defending here because they subsequently recaptured his aeroplane. At the end of the exercise, the post-exercise wash-up, all the Blue Force commanders said, as soon as we saw his aeroplane flying over our position, all our guys got out of their wagons, off their horses, out of their slit trenches and ran around waving their hands in the air. Because 98% of the people at that stage had never seen an aeroplane. And at that point we thought, the game's up, we've been spotted, we might as well all go home. So both sides suddenly realised the importance and value of aerial reconnaissance. Okay? But there still remained the problem, if you haven't got a phone box, what do you do? This gentleman here came up with the answer. That gentleman is, as you can see from the caption, by the name of Robert Lorraine. Robert Lorraine was a very famous West End actor. He was very prominent in George Bernard Shaw plays in the West End. And his routine was to do his play in the evening, and when he'd finished his acting, get in his car, drive down here, sleep overnight in a local pub, come up here, do some flying, back in his car, back to London, do his stage show, and then just repeat the pattern. Okay? Now, we didn't have the A303 then, bad though it is these days. So he was getting in his car in London, driving down these narrow country lanes in the dark, in the rain and the wind, getting here, having some sleep, flying back up to London, repeat, 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 repeat. The other point about Robert Lorraine is, you can see there his right hand is holding the control column of the aeroplane. He so loved flying that he described the control column as the joystick, his stick of joy, because whenever he held that, it was full of joy because he was going flying. In fact, I've recently seen something that described him, Robert Lorraine, as that age's Tom Cruise, because he was an actor and he loved flying, just like Tom Cruise apparently does these days. So he had the joystick, that was his joy, but what importantly he did for our story is that box there and this one here. Same thing, it's a Thorn Baker radio equipment. What he did was he put the radio on a trestle behind his pilot seat, and down here where his finger is pointing, he had a Morse key. He flew out that way for about a mile and a half, doesn't sound much, but a mile and a half, tapped on his Morse key, and that transmission was picked up in our crew room on a ground station. And that was the first successful air-to-ground transmission. Voice transmission wouldn't work in those days, it wasn't strong enough. The best way to do it was with Morse code. But it proved that you could do aerial reconnaissance, spot the oncoming forces, and report back using air-to-ground communications. So the ground rules and the foundations of aerial reconnaissance were being laid as long ago as 1910. And this is something that the Royal Artillery then developed and took into the First World War and the Second World War, and still does today. Excuse me. Okay, one or two quick photographs. Bristol box kite. That's the hangar we're parked in there. You can see that there is another hangar and there is a fifth one there. Those are the two that way from me. They were set up as a flying school. So these hangars were where the aircraft were erected, put together and stored and maintained, and those two there were the Bristol Flying School. Okay. So we now have these 5 hangars, We have the original 3 at the top of the road from Horatio Barber and all the others. We then have 6 other War Office hangars built. So we've got 14 hangars in a line that way, facing out that way onto the flying ground, the airfield. Okay. The other point about this picture is we have a lady sat there, presumably going for a flight, sat on top of the fuel tank. Health and safety wasn't a big thing. By dint of the fact that you can see the pilot sat there, he's got no harness on, he's got no belt on, he's got no flying helmet on, nothing. But presumably she was about to go for a flight. We don't know, but that's the case. Here we have a slightly different type of aircraft. Where you can see the word British obscured by the tail, that's the hangar just behind you and to my right, the end of one of the 3. But you can see it's a different type of aircraft, it's much more advanced. It's got a pilot's position, an observer's position, front-mounted engine, 2-bladed propeller, 4-wheel undercarriage. It looks more like a World War I aeroplane. And we're still only in about 1910 or 1911. So it shows how fast the technology was developing. Here we have the Army's first aeroplane. Hey. This is an aeroplane called a BE-1, Blériot Experimental 1. You can see there between the pilot and the engine block, that writing there is on the roof of this building. It said the Bristol Flying School, ... some other stuff. There are our other 2 hangars. This is one of the War Office hangars, and you can see there's a gap there. That gap was left deliberately because the owners of Stonehenge at the time, the Antrobus family, wrote to the War Office and said, "Oi guys, you can't keep building these hangars in a row because when you stand at Stonehenge, they're on the skyline. And when we stand at Stonehenge on Midsummer morning and watch the sun come up over there, your hangars are going to spoil the view." So the War Office agreed to leave a gap. And that is the gap between this hangar and that one there, the sun gap. And that's just beyond that far wall. As it turned out to be quite useful actually, because people flying in from that direction, if they realised they were off course, drifting to the left or whatever, they could quickly nip to the right and fly down the sun gap to avoid hitting the back of the building, which is not a good thing. So you can see we've got the Army stood around having a look. This is, as I said, a BE-1. Down here on the table is a model of the BE-2, which was the development of this aeroplane. That particular aeroplane, tail number 4131, was built by the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company, i.e. the guys in here, and was subsequently allocated, I think, to number 3 Squadron, which I'll come on to in a minute. But you can see the Army is already experimenting and thinking seriously about aeroplanes. As I said, we've got 14 hangars. There are our 5, 6 War Office hangars and 3 more out of the picture. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 aircraft parked at the front of various different designs. So this is quite an active airfield at the time. A lot of flying going on here, a lot of people coming up here to have a look and see what was going on. They put a sign up there basically saying keep off. This sign was put up after there was one unfortunate accident when a guy was flying in from that direction. He'd landed and was taxiing his aircraft up the front. This particular aircraft had a very tall engine right in front of him, which obscured his frontal vision. 2 boys ran out in front of him and he ran straight over the top of them. Turned the aeroplane on its back, killed the first guy, seriously injured his mate, the second one. The lad he killed, or who died in the accident, he didn't kill him, who died in the accident, was subsequently buried in the churchyard in Amesbury. So this was 1912, I think it was. In 1943, a Spitfire crashed onto the grave of that lad who'd been killed out the front here. He's the only person to have been hit by 2 aeroplanes 30 years apart. But it just showed, people were still unaware of what aeroplanes could do and how unpredictable they could be, both in the air and on the ground. There were a lot of accidents like this. Right, 1911, the Air Battalion Royal Engineers is formed. the army finally gets their act together. That gentleman there with the halo around his head is Fulton, Captain Fulton from earlier on. He's the commanding officer. These are the ground crew, who are made up of non-commissioned officers and soldiers from the Royal Engineers. The pilots of the air battalion were all either Royal Artillery, Cavalry or Navy. And they were all officers because they had to pay for their own instruction and it was expensive. So there was a divide. The ground crew were NCOs and soldiers, the pilots were officers. But at last the army has formed a proper unit, and you can just see the inside there of one of these buildings, our hangars. You can just see the corrugated iron walls. You can see how primitive they were. The following year, 1912, the Royal Flying Corps is formed. And then we've got a nice collection of people and rather strange, odd uniforms. One particular point, you remember I told you about the young lad who was killed out the front here? That gentleman there has the unfortunate record of being the pilot of the aeroplane that ran over him. A guy called Lieutenant Burchard Ashton. However, he subsequently went on to have a career in the Royal Flying Corps. The reason we like this photo particularly is the fact that it's the 3rd Squadron. Now, when the Royal Flying Corps was formed, the first 3 squadrons, surprisingly, were called 1st, 2nd and 3rd. 3rd Squadron was given the responsibility of flying fixed-wing, heavier-than-air aircraft, as opposed to balloons, kites, dirigibles, airships, which 1 and 2 Squadron were flying. Their motto, which they adopted, was "The 3rd shall be the 1st." And the crest that they initially adopted was the green and white stripes of the Wiltshire flag and the Great Bustard. So they very much allocated themselves to the fact that they were here in Wiltshire as opposed to Farnborough or Brooklands. As I said, their motto was "The 3rd shall be 1st." Even to this day, 3 Squadron RAF have the same motto. And what I like to say to people who come here who are in the Air Force is, guys, before you were ever flying aeroplanes, the Army were flying them. And not only that, the Royal Artillery were flying them. So we don't get many RAF people in here, but when we do, it's good fun. Okay, the War Office then organises a military flying competition, or military aeroplane competition, the autumn of 1912. They put 20 new temporary hangars up out the back here, and they invite people to bring their privately owned and developed aeroplanes to here for a series of tests, with the aim of finding the best aeroplane for the British Army. You can see one of the competitors there, quite a nice looking aeroplane. The idea was there were 8 tests, things like altitude gained, load carrying capacity, speed, endurance, takeoff run, landing run, and observability for the pilot and the observer. One of the first tests that they had to pass was the aeroplanes were all required to arrive here in a packing case and to be unpacked and assembled, and they would be tested on how quickly that could be done. Okay? That was the first test. That was mandatory. You had to do that. There were then the other 8 tests that I described. So this competition was run through the autumn, and this is the aeroplane that won. Now, there's one of the other competitors. Okay? By comparison between that aeroplane and the previous aeroplane in the picture, and that one, which one looks the more advanced?
Definitely not that one.
This one had been built from 3 other aeroplanes, all owned by the pilot, which had crashed in the previous 5 weeks, and then just stuck them all together, glue, sticky tape, bits of sticky back plastic, tape, glue. He was called Cody, SF Cody. He won the competition, despite the fact that his aeroplane was flown in. It didn't arrive in a packing case, as was required. It wasn't done on the first test, which is how quickly you can take it out of the packing case and assemble it. He flew it in and landed here. He then took about 3 out of the 8 tests, didn't participate in some of the others, then he won the competition. Now, cast your mind back. I showed you the photograph of the BE-1. Yep. Similar to that one down there, that model aeroplane. The Army already had that in service. They decided that this was the winner of the flying competition, the aeroplane competition, and as promised, the Army gave him £5,000 as a prize, bought his first 2 aeroplanes off him, having accepted and admitted that that was probably the better aeroplane. The reason that wasn't in the competition was it was owned by the government, and these were all private entries, so it wasn't allowed in the competition. They bought these 2 aeroplanes off him. They flew one around for a while. The other one they stuck in a hangar. And somebody told me this morning that that replica of that original aeroplane is now at Farnborough. But the Army didn't proceed with them, even though he'd won the competition. The rumour is he had mates in the high offices in London, and they decided that he was going to win the competition because he was their mate. But, you know, I'd put that to you, take it or leave it. Okay, why have I got a picture of a railway? Anybody know the answer? Right. On the skyline there, you'll see our 5 hangars, and we're sat in the middle one. There's the 6 War Office hangars, there's one of the original 3, but you can see all these white dots. They are tents. The flying ground is now being gradually transferred into a tented camp, and a lot of supplies for the tented camp, and indeed soldiers to be trained here at Larkhill, were being brought in by rail. This is Amesbury railway station, which is now Tesco's. From Amesbury they built a railway line that went through Bulford and Tidworth out that way. They then took a spur off that line which came across Countess Road, came along an embankment down to the south of us, up the end of the road opposite us, where you can still see in the tangle of brambles the original railway platform, crossed the main road, ran through the garrison, out the far end, turned left and went down to the south past Stonehenge. That was the Larkhill Military Railway, which was built in about 1913, 1912, the dates are a bit uncertain, and lasted till mid-20s. And designed to bring troops and tented camps and stores. Okay. This sort of show brings about the end of flying here. So, you know, we're now in 1913, people have realised that there's a war coming, they want to train the troops, and this land is used for training. This is the last bit of flying that happened here. The maiden flight of the Bristol Scout. That photograph is taken just over there, just out the front of the hangar next door to us. The Bristol Scout was taken into service by the Royal Flying Corps and served with the Royal Flying Corps in the early years of the First World War. More significantly, as I said, 23rd of February, the maiden flight was right outside here. The other point about this aeroplane is this was the first British aeroplane to take offensive weaponry into the air. Not just pistols, but a proper machine gun. Now, obviously the idea was use a machine gun for air warfare. However, what happens if you put a machine gun in front of the pilot and fire it? It chops your propeller to shreds because it's firing straight through there. What they did in this case was they put the machine gun just here on the side of the fuselage on a mounting which could be swung out at 45 degrees. So you're flying along, you spot the enemy, you get your round magazine of ammunition, pop it on the gun, swing it out, blast off your rounds, swing it back in, another magazine, out at 45 degrees. So you're firing at the enemy over there. Not terribly practical, but it proved that you could take a machine gun into the air and use it offensively, which would obviously become useful in 1914. Okay. So that, as I said, was really the end of the flying here. This is what we're left with. Those are our hangars. These are all the tented camps springing up. And you can just see there that the buildings gradually started reverting to just being barrack stores. That's what they remained right the way through the 1930s, Second World War, right up to recently when we moved in here 3 years ago now. That's the story from 1909 to 1914. 5 years going from Horatio Barber right the way through to the Bristol Scout, taking its machine gun up into the air and paving the way for World War I fighter aircraft. All in 5 years. In that time, they laid the ground rules for aerial reconnaissance, the Royal Artillery. They trained a lot of Royal Artillery pilots who then went on to serve in the Royal Flying Corps. And they then also took that idea and had Royal Artillery pilots flying in the Second World War over the jungles of Burma, spotting for the artillery and the guns on the ground. And all the way through, that led through to what we now have of aerial reconnaissance and the Army Air Corps, flying their Apache helicopters around. So the basic foundations of that were laid here by the Royal Artillery, and that's why we tell this story. Where I like to leave this is the company who built these hangars, the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company, changed their name to Bristol Aeroplane Company and built Bristol Fighter, the Bristol Scout, the Bristol Blenheim, the Bristol Beauforter, the Bristol Britannia, the Bristol Bloodhound missile, and then in Filton ended up doing the British bits of Concorde. So a lot of the foundations of that company and their expertise was developed here in these very buildings. That's all I've got for you. Very quick, I know. If you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.